Good afternoon. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center. I have 1 o'clock, so we're going to begin the webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are so very pleased to be able to host this webinar on behalf of the Active Transportation Academy, which is a program that the Ohio LTAP Center is able to offer through funding from the Pedestrian and Bike Safety Program here in Ohio. And we have with us Amelia Mansfield, who will be presenting for you today. But before I turn things over to Amelia, I want to go through just a few housekeeping items. On your screen, hopefully you see a chat pod on the bottom left-hand corner. If you don't, please look for a round circle with a thought bubble in it and click on that, and that should display the chat pod. The reason I want you to have your chat pod displayed is that during the actual presentation we have everyone muted, but if you have questions, we want you to be able to ask those, and the chat pod is the way to do that. If you'll put your questions in the chat pod, I will read them off to Amelia as she takes a breath and is working through the presentation, so that way I can make certain that we have your questions in the dialogue and hopefully get an answer for you. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that at the end of the webinar, if we have some time, we will definitely open the phone lines up for audio questions. But we do encourage you to please put your questions in the chat pod. And again, that's the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you don't see the chat pod there, look for the circle with the thought bubble on it and click on that, and it should display your chat pod. The other thing is that we are attempting to record the webinar. Please don't let that dampen your enthusiasm for asking questions, because if you have a question, I'm certain that there are plenty of other people that have the same question. But hopefully, if we are able to get the recording to work properly, we'll be able to send you a link when everything's finished to a recording of the webinar and also a copy of the slides, because really this webinar today is to just whet your appetite for hosting the Mobility Solutions Transit's First and Last Mile course. So Amelia, I think I've got all my items completed. You're still muted. There you go.
All right, can you hear me, Victoria?
Sure can.
All right, great. Well,
thanks.
Thank you for having me today to share with everyone what the Mobility Solutions Transit's First and Last Mile course will be like when you host it in your community. So as Victoria so kindly introduced me, my name is Amelia. I work for Burton Planning Services, and through the Active Transportation Academy, I have the roles of instructor, as I'm serving today, but I also develop courses and manage the Active Transportation Academy trainings. So when you reach out and apply to host a training in your community, I'll be the main point of contact after ODOT lets you know whether you're approved to host it. So I look forward to working with all of you for upcoming trainings. So for today's agenda, I'm going to take a few minutes to share with you a bit about the Active Transportation Academy in case you aren't familiar or might want a reminder about how easy it is to host a training in your own community. Then we'll get into what the Mobility Solutions course will actually be like when you bring it to your community. And we will talk about, again, how to apply to host to bring it to your own community in the future. So the Active Transportation Academy's purpose is to offer training to help communities reach your active transportation goals. So this is for not only transportation planners and engineers, but public health professionals, local leaders, volunteers, grassroots organizations, school districts, you name it. Anyone who might have a vested interest in helping to make walking and biking safer and more easily accessible in communities across the entire state of Ohio, regardless of whether you're rural, urban, or suburban, or somewhere in between. The trainings are free, and we strive to make it as easy as possible for you as the host entity to have these trainings. So we do most of the work on the back end and rely on you simply to do a few things, such as providing the training space, making sure there's audio-visual equipment, and inviting people to come and be a part of the training itself. But otherwise, we do everything for you to make sure that it's even more enticing to have it come to your community. So there is a way to get to the Active Transportation Academy site on ODOT LTAP's webpage, and you can navigate through this process here of going to ODOT's website, then going to planning, then going to LTAP, and then Active Transportation Academy. Once Victoria publishes this training, you can click directly on that green hyperlink, but also if you Google ODOT LTAP Active Transportation Academy, it'll take you right there. And so you can see all of this information as well as a listing of courses that are available, upcoming webinars, and then the application to apply to host the training. We have 3 new courses, the first being Mobility Solutions that we're going to talk about today. We also have Creating a Vision Zero Action Plan, which was released a few months ago, and then Creating a Rural Active Transportation Plan will be released in next month. So there is actually a webinar coming up in July on that one as well. We have other 4-hour basic training courses listed here, so covering a wide variety of topics. They're all implementation focused, so not only the 101 type of information of what is it that we're talking about and what's the need for it, but then how do we apply this in our communities. And we strive to have every training have interactive components, make them applicable to the community that's hosting the training. So we do some background research to make sure that statistics and publications that we're referring to are directly related to the community where we're giving the training. And then some of these have some feet on the street type of activities. For example, the conducting walk and bike audits actually involves a mock walk audit. We have the trainer courses, and these are geared toward school districts mostly, but we often have planners and engineers attending, and community planning departments and engineering departments hosting these, as well as school districts. The idea being that you would teach people in the school community how to conduct a school walk audit, so that then they can go and bring other people together to do that throughout their school district, or teaching crossing guards how to teach other crossing guards on how to do their job, and so on and so forth. We have other Safe Routes to School implementation and training courses as well here, so you can see there's a very wide variety of things to bring to your community, and we're always happy to work with you directly to customize these trainings to meet your needs. So if you feel like you need something that is crossing guard training, but you want a little bit of information in there about safety and active transportation in schools, then we can help to add that in as well. So coming soon, we're going to actually launch some of these online on demand so that they're accessible at any time. Crossing guard training, advocating for active transportation, and community traffic calming programs will be coming out soon. So stay tuned and make sure to sign up for the LTAP emails, because you'll be able to know first and foremost when those are available. Okay, so now we'll get into a taste of what the Mobility Solutions Transit's First and Last Mile 4-hour course will be like. So I want to preface this and remind you again what Victoria had mentioned, that this is just a teaser. So normally this training would be 4 hours long. There would be interactive activities, and we would customize the materials for your community. I'm going to breeze through a lot of materials, and I just want you to keep in mind that when we actually host the training, they'll be much more detailed. We promise you're going to learn things that you wouldn't have known already, but we hope that the next bit of this webinar will encourage you to reach out and apply to host it in your community. So the goals and learning outcomes of the Mobility Solutions course are listed here, but what we strive to do is to help you and your community partners ultimately have the practical knowledge that you need to implement a mobility solutions-based program to make sure that people can safely and easily get to transit by walking and biking through different infrastructure and program solutions. And so you'll walk away from the 4-hour training understanding how this might apply to your community, regardless of where you are with your transit service or lack thereof, where you are with your infrastructure in your community for biking and walking or for programs that help people do that. We also want you to be familiar with different concepts and the need for walking and biking as it relates to transit service. And we anticipate that there will be a lot of trainings that communities will host that will not only have planners and engineers there, but also the transit agency that serves their community and people who might offer paid services for mobility solutions, such as bike share providers or private transit companies. So the full course agenda is broken down into 3 different sections. There are not 8 sections. This was me not knowing how to do math through the 1 through 8 here. So we would always start the training with welcome and introductions, making sure everyone is familiar with each other in the room and making sure that the trainer is familiar with whoever is in the room. Then we would spend 45 minutes introducing everyone and refreshing their minds on what active transportation and transit mean, what the correlation between the two is, looking at some local data of transit ridership, for example, looking at maps of where the transit stops are in the community if they currently exist, what the active transportation network is like, who might be using it in their community through demographic information, and then getting into the meat of it, which is planning and evaluating your mobility solutions options to make sure people can walk and bike to transit, and then looking at how to implement those strategies through some activities that will help the trainees walk away with notes on exactly what it is they're going to do when they get back to the office the next day. And then we wrap up the class with Q&A and any type of follow-up that might be needed. So the first section, as I mentioned, is the intro, and so this is what I was mentioning before, is more of like the 101. We will start off with looking at concepts that are related to active transportation and transit. So definitions and terminology, just to make sure everyone is speaking the same language as we move through the day of our 4-hour training. Looking at transit and the different types of information and services and data that are related to that, and then wrapping up that section by talking about what is meant by first and last mile and what is meant by mobility solutions. So we look at active transportation definitions and see that many different sources define active transportation, and we try to pull from different fields. That way whoever is in the training can feel like it relates to the work that they do. So for example, the Centers for Disease Control has a definition for what active transportation means, and as does the FHWA, as does the Complete Streets Coalition, and so on and so forth. But the way that we're defining it for this training is anything that is a human-powered, self-propelled type of transportation. This can include wheelchairs, strollers, canes. It could include bicycling, walking, but nothing motorized per se. And then we also consider transit as an active transportation adjacent mode because most trips on transit start and end with some sort of active transportation, whether it's getting off of another form of motorized transportation and walking or rolling to the transit stop, or actually, biking a mile to get there. So we'll also get into the terminology of what these different active transportation words mean, and some of this is going to be second nature knowledge to people who are in the training, but some of them might be new terms. Sometimes different communities call things differently, and so again, we just want to get on the same playing field about what the words are that we're using as we move through the training and talk about actual mobility solutions. So we would talk about all of these in detail, but I'm going to use the sidewalk as an example of how we would get into more detail about each of these active transportation terms. So we would talk about the definition of what is a sidewalk, where is it located. So a sidewalk is located within the right-of-way, what's it made out of. So in this case, we talk about how it's typically concrete, but it could be other materials. And we would make sure that we would work with the host of the training to make sure that the information that we're putting in these is relevant for that specific community. Because if you're hosting it in your community that only has asphalt sidewalks, then we would make sure to mention that in the training as well. Then we would look at a schematic so that people could get the visual of what that term is. And for those people who are visual learners, this is a great way to make that relate to them. So then we would talk about complete streets definitions, and again, we try to take it from different sources so that it's relevant to whomever is there in the training. And so the commonality between all of these definitions is that it's safe facilities for people of all ages and abilities, no matter what mode they're using. And so we try to pair that with active transportation and then later on with transit, and how does it all fit in. Again, we get into transit terms, and so for the sake of this teaser webinar, we're just showing you what the definitions are, what the different terms are that we would talk about in more detail. But again, similar to the active transportation facilities, we would get into each of these in a little bit more detail, showing photos, showing examples, either locally or nationally if you don't have a local example. With transit, it seems that based on the usual trainee population that we serve, the transit terms might be some of the terms that wouldn't be as familiar. So we'll make sure to get into much more detail on these. Here are a few other of those: on-demand, flex route, paratransit. And again, some of these might be slightly different depending on the training community, so we'll make sure to customize that for you. Then we get into first and last mile, and what does that mean? And I know that in different lines of work, first and last mile is actually a term. I was talking to a friend who's in the healthcare research industry, and he was saying that first and last mile is used in his field as well. And I was surprised to know that, but it helped me realize the relevance of getting into what the definition is in this training. So we'll talk about what it means, and for the sake of this training, it's that leg of a trip that is before or after getting onto public transit. And we're going to go even further to say it's that active transportation trip. So the walking, the biking, the use of a mobility aid. We get into a little bit more of saying how, first and last mile is a part of a bigger conversation of identifying mobility options in a community. There might be, many other solutions, such as things like Uber and Lyft, but we're not going to get into that in this training. It's specifically meant to be, how do we get people walking and biking and connect them to the transit and make sure there's the right infrastructure and services and programs available for them to do that safely. So here's an example of then, how we break this down. And so this trifecta, if you will, is the way that we go through the rest of the training. So we're talking about policy, systems, and environment. If you're in the public health world or the planning world, that's probably a very familiar term to you. And we're going to follow that through the course of this 4-hour training. And so the policy-based options that we'll get into, as an example, could be developing an ordinance that encourages ride sharing or scooter sharing. A system or service-based option would be partnering with a taxi company or providing on-demand public transportation, putting together a safe routes to school program, things like that. And then the environment or infrastructure-based option examples is things like sidewalks, installing bike share stations, etc. So then we get into the benefits and challenges of bicycle and pedestrian connections to transit. So this is setting the stage for the rest of the course. So understanding, why are we here today? What is it that is driving us to even bring this up in our community? And so something that's always helpful, and I'm sure you all know this from your own experience, is when you're out talking to constituents, stakeholders, potential partners, you want to be able to tell them what the benefits are of this project you're working on, in this case, mobility solutions. So we talk about the benefits of safety for both pedestrians and motorists, We talk about the benefits of health, and so having to do with chronic disease and illness that's exacerbated by inactivity, talking about air pollution and air quality and how if less people are spending time in their personal vehicles, the air quality is improved. Talk about obesity rates in both children and adults. The very important topic of equity, and that not everyone has access to a car, not everyone lives on a transit line, not everyone has the same physical abilities to walk a mile to get to a bus. So what are other options? Talk about traffic congestion, which depending on who your stakeholders are, this could be a really major talking point. And we talk about the economic benefits as well. How does it improve property values? How does it help people get to work and to school? And how overall quality of life is the biggest benefit, improvement of that. We also talk about challenges. And so we're talking about how, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, how mobility solutions don't have one quick fix. It's a systemic type of process to go through. And so the active transportation first and last mile solutions is one part of that. And within it, we have that policy, systems, and environment approach that's needed to make sure that the active transportation needs are addressed. And so we also talk about how expertise and technical assistance isn't always easy to come by, depending on your community. We also talk about funding sources. In all of our Active Transportation Academy trainings, we do spend at least 15 minutes towards the end of the training talking about funding that specifically pertains to the community that the training is being hosted within. And then we talk about the challenge of changing habits. And so for those of you in the public health world, this is something that you live every single day, and we really rely on you as one of the trainees in the course to talk about this. And we talk about the psychology a little bit and different programming that might help. We also make sure to include a lot of best practices in the course because people want to see where this has been done before successfully. So we not only look at examples nationwide, but we also pull from local examples. And so that's something that I would be coordinating with the host who applies to have the training in their community to see if there are any local examples that my team isn't aware of, so we can put them into the presentation materials so that the folks that are involved in the training can understand how it applies to them. So this example from King County, Washington is showing how bike and bus facilities can interact seamlessly and much more safely. And so we'll take a look at this more in the training itself, but you can see how it doesn't take up more than a parking section of a parking lane, and when the bus pulls up, the bikes can continue going, and there's no interaction with the pedestrians and the bus as well. So, and that's one example of a best practice that we talk about. In this case, this is the environmental change. So then we get into the second part of the training, which gets into a little bit more new content for the trainees. And so this is the whole section where we're talking about assessing existing conditions and the demand for transit and active transportation in your community, and looking at strategies for bike and pedestrian mobility solutions for first and last mile. So we talk about, how do you assess the current conditions in your community? For those of you that are planners, this is a common process that you go through in your day-to-day work. For the rest of people that attend these trainings, this is a new process, and so we do get into it a bit, and we like to rely on the planners in the room to share their experiences and to lead some of the conversations when we get into group activities. So we talk about I'm sorry, I thought I touched the screen and it advanced without me planning to. So we talk about key drivers of transit use, including all of these things listed in here. So we're actually looking at data from your community. So my team will be reaching out to the MPO in your community, any transit providers if they exist, to the planning department, and we'll be looking at other data that's readily available online to make sure it's relevant to the people that are in the training you're hosting. We talk about how conditions and demand for transit vary depending on the community type. So that's that rural to urban, transect conversation. And if you're an MPO, for example, and you're hosting this training, we will talk about all of them in a lot of detail. If you're a suburban community, we'll focus a little bit more on that, but we'll make sure to definitely talk about all of those different community types because, as we all know, things don't stop at the municipal boundary. So what our neighbors have going on in their communities is just as important as what's going on in our own. We talk about level of service as well, and so for the engineers, this is something that tends to be of more interest, and again, using that data that's relevant to your community gets all of this kick-started. We also want to talk about understanding the processes and the situation of your transit agencies that serve your community, if there are any, because even though that's not, actual data that can be analyzed, it's relevant background information for understanding why transit stops are located where they are, why they may not serve particular areas, and why you need these first and last mile solutions. So we do the same thing then for active transportation data. And ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to show you where to get this data so that you can analyze it yourself. And we're going to actually do some of the analyzation in the training of the data, and that'll come into play when we get to an activity. And then we start talking about, okay, so we understand what our demand and need and existing conditions are for transit and walking and biking in our community. So how do we put that information together and develop strategies to address them? And so we get into that policy, systems, and environment structure again. And we start off by talking about public involvement. So we'd be remiss if we didn't mention this in every single training we do. So we also, want to make sure that the people that would ultimately be using these first and last mile solutions are going to be involved in our process. And so we talk about who in our community that we're hosting this training would be important to involve and what might be some of their specific interests and needs. We talk about short-term versus long-term strategies and get into some detail about what those might be. And then talking about how partners are really important, and that just because you are the person attending this training or hosting this training doesn't mean that you have to tackle all of this. Who are the people in your community that you might want to partner with that aren't in the training at that time? So again, we get into that difference of context of strategies are going to be dependent on the community's type, their land use. If there is an area that's already inherently walkable, strategies might be more programmatic because you already have the infrastructure. But if you're in a place that doesn't have any infrastructure, then that might be a strategy that would be more short-term versus long-term. So we talk about that as well. So here's an example of how we would break that down by the rural to urban transect. So if we're talking about suburban communities, we would break it down to this level of detail and even beyond. So, we say if it's in a suburban community, there is probably a need for a connection to commuter transit because suburbs are the bedroom communities, and people might want to connect as opposed to actually going to a bus stop at the corner of a street in their residential community in an urban area. We talk about common challenges based on the community type. And so in a suburban community, for example, we talk a lot about the circuitous street network and the need for the long distance to get to a transit facility. Some suburban communities don't even have transit. So how do we extend the active transportation network to get to those places? We talk about appropriate solutions for the suburban communities. And so we, again, break it down by policy, system, and environment, and try to make it as relevant as possible to the community that's hosting the training. So in this case, we have a walking school bus picture that is not from Ohio community, but if you're hosting it and you have a program like this nearby, we would absolutely include that in the materials. That way, it's a reminder to you to believe that you can actually do this in your community. And then here below, we have an example of design, and so we make sure to put images in there of that as well, and relate back to best practices that after the fact you can point back to.
Amelia, this is Victoria. We haven't had any questions yet, but I just wanted to mention that on that comment of customizing it, I can tell you from the post-course evaluations we've gotten back for the sessions Amelia's taught, we always get great comments on how she works with the requester to customize the courses for what their specific needs are. So I would definitely encourage you, if you're going to request a session, to make sure you reach out to her when she contacts you to confirm the date and have that in-depth conversation about what are you really trying to get to by hosting this training, and she can help you customize the delivery of it to achieve your goals. Thanks.
Thank you. Victoria, you were cutting out, and I'm hoping that it wasn't my connection, so please let me know if you suddenly can't hear me, okay?
Okay, we will.
All right, thanks. Okay, so the first two of the three activities in this training happen in this second section. So what we're going to be doing is actually looking at maps that include data from your community and breaking you out into small groups based on either the department that you work within, or if there are multiple communities attending this training, then we would break you up by community. It just depends on, again, that customization of who's attending your specific training. But we're going to look at maps that have data relevant to your jurisdiction and identify the first and last mile gaps in your community. Of course, this isn't going to be comprehensive. We're only spending 30 minutes or so doing this, but it's a great way to get you comfortable with then how you would apply it to your entire community or the neighborhood that you want to do this within initially. Then we build off of that activity a little bit later in that second half of the training to pick one of those first and last mile gaps that you identified in the first activity, and then work towards identifying different strategies to address that. So a policy, a system, and an environmental change related to a strategy. That way you can see how you would work with the different parties to make sure that you were addressing it on that tri-level methodology. And so you then, again, walk out of this training having identified some of the gaps, identifying some potential strategies, and understanding what that process looks like so you can replicate it. So then we get into the last part of the training, which is implementing first and last mile strategies. So you've already identified the need. You've already looked at gaps. You've already trained yourself on what the policy, system, and environmental type of strategy development might be like. And so now how do you take that and actually implement this? So we first are going to start out with project prioritization. And so this is, understanding that you can't do it all at once. So how do you figure out what you're going to do first, and what are the different methodologies to do that? So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Just because you're a suburban community doesn't mean you're going to do it the same as another suburban community. Or just because you're a community that has 10,000 people doesn't mean you're going to do it the same way as another community that with 10,000 people. So understanding that different things are going to work for different people. But we'll talk about the different factors that go into prioritization, location, cost, timeline, different resources, and some other criterion as well. And then we're going to look at prioritization examples so that you can see how other communities have done it. We'll also look at project design. So whether or not you are an engineer or have any engineering background, we'll be looking at infrastructure-based strategies and different resources for where you might go to understand how best to make those first and last mile connections for walking and biking. We'll look at resources that are publications such as the NACDO guides. We'll look at ODOT's website, and we'll show you different places to go to look at Ohio-based design guidance. And also, if you have a local transit provider, we'll take a look at what their transit design guides might be like. We'll again talk about project partners, specifically for the jurisdictions and the entities that the trainees in your training represent. And we will talk about different roles that might be appropriate. And this isn't to say that one entity is best suited to do any particular thing in implementing these first and last mile strategies. It's more of starting that conversation with you and the group to get you thinking about how it might work best in your community. So then, as I mentioned, we get into funding. And so we will talk in general about some different sources, but then we'll get into more specific examples. When we're doing the prep work for your training, we'll make sure to look through different funding databases and pull out anything that might be relevant for you. But then we also will follow up in an email after the training with any direct links to different funding sources that might not be included in the training materials, but that we discuss when we're having conversation. We'll also look at ODOT's active transportation funding matrix, which is available online, and make sure you know where to get to that and how to use it, because that's updated more regularly than the static presentation that we email out to you afterwards will be. So hopefully that'll be helpful for you. We'll talk about other resources as well. So understanding that you're having this 4-hour training, that you'll have the materials from the training to refer back to, but you're going to need to dig into other things because this is going to take way more than 4 hours of your time to figure out how to address your mobility first and last mile solutions. So we'll take a look at the ones that are listed here plus some others just to get you familiar with what they might look like, how they might function, so that if you're someone who wants to flip through a book, you might order some of these things. If you're a department or a community who likes to do things that are web-based and interactive, we'll show you some of those resources as well. Then we finish the training with a final activity, and this is actually identifying who are you going to involve, when are you going to start doing this, how are you going to fund things, and so we'll build off again of those first two activities of identifying the first and last mile gaps in your community, picking one or two of them to identify a policy, systems, and or environment strategy, and then talking about, okay, for those strategies that you've identified in those first two activities, what's the who, what, when, where, and how for that. And you'll walk away with it, and you'll be able to share it with your coworkers and get things started then. So the last part of this webinar is to refresh your memory about how to bring a training to your town, and then we can get into Q&A. So again, the trainings for the most part are 4 hours. This one that we just went through today for Mobility Solutions is a 4-hour training. Depending on what time of day you want to host it, you might choose to have me build in time to have refreshments or a brown bag lunch or whatever, but we'll talk about that once you have your application approved. The three group activities are a key point in this training. They tend to be a part that people really enjoy. After the training, within 2 weeks, I send out an email to all of the trainees with a copy of the presentation materials and a certificate of participation that they can use to either hang on their refrigerator or they can use it to give to their HR department or for self-reporting for continuing education credits. If anyone who's attending the training is AICP through American Planning Association, they'll be able to find the training listed on APA's website, and they'll be able to claim their credits that way. If you want to apply for a course, you can again Google ODOT LTAP Active Transportation Academy, or you can click on this link in Victoria's email when she sends out the follow-up. It's a very short form that will only require you to put in what training you are seeking and any preference of dates that you might want to host it. And then what will happen is you'll submit that, and then Victoria will get back to you and let you know if you're approved. And if you are, I will follow up to talk about logistics and solidifying things to get it on the calendar. We ask that you commit to having at least 15 people participate and make sure that there's a space for the training. Usually classroom style or boardroom style is preferred. That way there's a way for people to have a writing surface and be able to look at a presentation projected on the wall. We're happy to help you recruit people to attend if you have trouble thinking of 15 people that might come, regardless, we're always happy to help with the promotional materials. And it's up to you to just keep track of who's coming. So with that, we hope that you are enticed to apply to host this training in your community or any of the other Active Transportation Academy trainings. And at this point, I'll hand it back to Victoria.
Thank you, Amelia. I'm going to go ahead and start unmuting everybody. And while I do that, just a warning in case there's a party going on in the background, you might want to ask them to hold it down. But I will, as I'm working through here, once I'm done, I'll let everybody know that they've been unmuted so they can ask questions. Now, the application will have the new course listed on there by the end of today, and I'll make sure to send that out in the email follow-up. And I will also make sure to send out a link to that online resource that Amelia mentioned about the funding that's available for the different projects. So I'm almost done unmuting everybody. I appreciate your patience. If you're towards the beginning of the alphabet, you can go ahead and try to ask a question if you've got one. I'm almost there. Okay, last person's unmuted, so if you're using your audio either through your phone or the computer, please feel free to go ahead and ask any questions that you have. Boy, this is a really quiet group. All right, well, they didn't have any questions in the chat pod, no questions over the phone. I will make certain, Amelia's got her contact information on the screen already, and I'll make certain that you have that in the email as well and have the contact information for the LTAP Center. But we do appreciate your time on the webinar today in learning about this particular course. Next month, we are going to be having the Rural Active Transportation course overview. And hopefully you saw the announcement for that in our webinar's announcement for July. So we encourage you to sign up for that one if you're interested. And we look forward to receiving lots of applications for this course to be held all over Ohio. So thank you, Amelia, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.